In suburban Phoenix, 43-year-old Sarah Mitchell discovered an old photograph that would unravel her entire reality. What began as spring cleaning became a journey into her past when she noticed something impossible in the background. Before we continue, drop a comment if you've ever experienced déjà vu. I'm Natalie, and the last time I watched my parents order filet mignon while sliding me a plate of 3-day-old meatloaf, I knew something had to change. What I didn't know was that by the end of that week, I'd be the one calling the police on them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell hit me first, that rich, buttery aroma of garlic bread and fresh pasta wafting from the dining room, while I stood in the kitchen, staring down at a container of leftover casserole that had been sitting in our refrigerator since Tuesday. It was Friday night, and the green bean casserole had developed that peculiar film that happens when food sits too long, even covered. The edges had hardened, and when I poked it with my fork it made a sound like cracking plastic. "Natalie, dinner's ready." Mom's voice carried from the other room, cheerful and light, as if she hadn't just handed me reheated leftovers while the rest of the family enjoyed steaming plates of fresh linguine alfredo from Mama Giovanna's, the Italian place downtown that cost $40 per entrée. I walked into the dining room, carrying my sad container, and the contrast was immediate and brutal. Kenneth, my father, was twirling perfect pasta around his fork, the cream sauce still bubbling slightly from the heat. Patricia, my mother, delicately cut into her chicken parmigiana, the cheese stretching in those satisfying strings you see in commercials. And Dylan, my 19-year-old brother, was already halfway through his second helping of garlic bread, reaching for more from the basket wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. "Smells good," I said, settling into my usual chair at the far end of the table. It wasn't really a question or a comment that expected a response. It was just something to fill the silence that always seemed to follow me into rooms. Kenneth glanced up briefly, sauce on his chin. "Mrs. Patterson recommended this place, said their seafood special is incredible, but we figured we'd start with the classics." He took another bite, closing his eyes as if savoring some transcendent experience. I opened my container. The casserole had cooled again during my walk from kitchen to dining room, and now it sat there like a small beige monument to disappointment. I took a bite. It tasted like salt and sadness, with that particular flavor that food develops when it's been reheated too many times. "How's school going, Dylan?" Patricia asked, reaching across to refill his wine glass. "Yes, wine." My 19-year-old brother got wine with dinner while I got tap water in a plastic cup that had seen better days. Dylan launched into a story about his college internship, something involving marketing and important meetings with clients whose names I didn't recognize. Kenneth and Patricia hung on every word, asking follow-up questions, laughing at his jokes, treating every mundane detail like it was fascinating. I ate my casserole and listened. This was my role in family dinner, the audience member who didn't get to participate in the show, just watch it unfold while choking down whatever had been deemed sufficient for my consumption. "What about you, Natalie?" Patricia asked, suddenly, almost as an afterthought. "How was your day?" I had been expecting this. The obligatory question that would last exactly 30 seconds before attention shifted back to Dylan or Kenneth's work stories or Patricia's book club drama. I got my essay back from Mrs. Henderson. She said it was one of the best she'd read this semester. "That's nice, honey." Patricia was already looking past me toward Kenneth, who was gesturing for her attention about something work-related. "She wants to submit it to the district writing competition." Kenneth was fully engaged with his pasta now, not even pretending to listen. I tried once more. "The winner gets a $1,000 scholarship." This got Dylan's attention, but not in the way I hoped. $1,000? That's barely enough for textbooks these days. My internship supervisor was just telling us about this program that offers $10,000 for business students. And just like that, the conversation shifted. Dylan talked about business scholarships, Kenneth offered advice about networking, Patricia mentioned articles she'd read about career development, and I went back to eating my cold casserole in silence. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and every other day of my 17 years of life. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way the steam rose from their plates while mine sat cold and lumpy. Maybe it was watching Dylan get his third glass of wine while I drank water from a cup with a cartoon character on it. Or maybe it was the realization that this wasn't just about food. The food was a symbol, a daily, tangible reminder that in the Brooks family hierarchy, I ranked somewhere below fresh groceries but above the houseplants. After dinner, I volunteered to clear the table. Not because anyone asked, but because it gave me something to do with my hands while they moved to the living room to continue their conversation about Dylan's bright future. I scraped their plates, rinsed expensive sauce from ceramic dishes, and loaded everything into the dishwasher. My container went straight into the trash. There had been enough left for another meal, but I couldn't bear the thought of facing it again tomorrow. As I wiped down the counters, I heard Patricia on the phone in the next room. "Oh, we had the most wonderful dinner from Mama Giovanna. Kenneth thinks we should make it a weekly tradition. The kids loved it." The kids, plural. As if I had been there participating, enjoying the same meal as everyone else. I finished cleaning and headed upstairs to my room. The house was old, built in the 1980s, and the stairs creaked in specific places. I had memorized which boards to avoid if I wanted to move quietly, a skill I'd developed over years of trying not to draw attention to myself. My bedroom was small, tucked under the eaves with a slanted ceiling that made it feel even more cramped. The furniture was mismatched, collected from garage sales and hand-me-downs. Dylan's room just down the hall had been professionally decorated when he graduated high school. Mine looked like a storage closet that someone had decided to put a bed in. I sat at my desk, a wobbly card table that served as both workspace and dining area when I ate meals in my room, which was off. My laptop was old, a refurbished model that Patricia had bought me for my birthday 2 years ago. It worked, mostly, though it took forever to load anything and had a habit of shutting down without warning. I opened a new document and started typing. Not homework, not the essay that Miss Henderson had praised. Just thoughts. A record of tonight's dinner, the cold casserole, the wine Dylan got to drink, the way my parents' eyes glazed over when I mentioned my achievement. Writing helped me process things. It made the experiences feel more real somehow, as if putting them into words proved they had actually happened. Because sometimes, sitting in that house, being ignored and forgotten, and fed leftovers, I felt like I was disappearing. The document grew longer as I wrote about other dinners, other forgotten achievements, other moments when I realized that my parents saw me as an inconvenience, rather than a daughter. I wrote about the time I won second place in the regional science fair, and came home to find them celebrating Dylan's acceptance into a summer program. I wrote about birthdays, where my cake came from the grocery store bakery, while Dylan's were custom ordered from the fancy place downtown. I wrote about Christmas morning last year, when Dylan unwrapped a new laptop, a designer watch, and an envelope containing money for a spring break trip to Europe, while I got a $25 gift card to Target, and a sweater that was clearly from the clearance rack. The words flowed out of me like water through a broken dam, years of small slights and casual neglect, documented in 12-point Times New Roman font. When I finally stopped typing, it was past midnight, and I had created a 15-page chronicle of what it felt like to be the unwanted child. I saved the document as evidence, and closed my laptop. The next morning was Saturday, which meant family breakfast. This was supposedly a Brooks family tradition, a time for everyone to come together and share a meal before starting the weekend. In reality, it was another opportunity for me to feel like an outsider in my own home. I came downstairs at 8:30 to find Kenneth at the stove, flipping pancakes with the confidence of someone who enjoyed cooking but only did it when the mood struck. Patricia was setting the table with the good plates, the ones we usually reserved for company. Dylan was fresh from his morning run, stretching in the kitchen while discussing his plans for the day. "Morning, sweetheart," Patricia said when she noticed me. "Perfect time. Dad's making his famous blueberry pancakes." Kenneth's blueberry pancakes were indeed famous in our house. He made them maybe once a month, always on Saturday mornings, always when he was in a particularly good mood. They were thick and fluffy, studded with fresh berries, and served with real maple syrup and butter that he whipped himself. I watched him plate the pancakes, creating neat stacks on each dish. 3 pancakes for Kenneth, 3 for Patricia, 4 for Dylan. He reached for a 4th plate, and I felt a moment of anticipation. Maybe today would be different. The 4th plate got 2 pancakes, smaller ones, clearly from the bottom of the batch, where the batter had started to thin out. Natalie's, Kenneth announced, setting my plate at my usual spot. I sat down and looked at my breakfast. 2 thin pancakes with exactly 3 blueberries between them, next to a family of people who had plates piled high with golden berry-filled perfection. "These look amazing, Dad," Dylan said, already cutting into his stack. "Remember when you taught me to make these during my senior year? I made them for my roommate last month, and he said they were better than his mom's." Kenneth beamed with pride. "It's all about not over-mixing the batter. Most people don't understand that." "You should write down the recipe," Patricia suggested, "for when Dylan has his own family someday." I poured syrup on my pancakes and took a bite. They were good, what little there was of them, but watching my family enjoy their generous portions, while I carefully rationed mine to make it last, I felt that familiar hollow sensation in my chest. "So what's everyone's plans for today?" Patricia asked, slicing her pancakes into perfect triangles. Dylan had a study group, then plans to meet friends for dinner at some new gastropub downtown. Kenneth was playing golf with his business partners. Patricia was attending a charity luncheon for the animal shelter board she had recently joined. "What about you, Natalie?" Patricia asked. I had been planning to spend the day at the library, working on college applications. I was a senior now and deadlines were approaching fast, but saying that out loud would require explaining which colleges I was applying to, which would lead to questions about costs and scholarships, and whether I had realistic expectations about my future. "Probably just homework," I said, instead. "Good girl," Kenneth said absently, focused on cutting his pancakes into precise squares. "Education is important." After breakfast, they scattered to their various activities, leaving me to clean up. Again, this wasn't officially my job, but it had become my job through a process of gradual assumption. No one ever asked me to clear the table, or load the dishwasher, or wipe down the counters, but no one else did it either, and someone had to. I scraped their plates, each one bearing only the smallest remnants of pancakes and syrup. Mine was completely clean. I had eaten every crumb. The kitchen fell silent after everyone left. This was actually my favorite time in the house, when I had it to myself and could move through the rooms without feeling like I was intruding. I made myself a piece of toast with peanut butter, my actual breakfast, and sat at the kitchen counter to eat it. The counter overlooked our backyard, which Patricia had spent considerable money landscaping. There was a deck with outdoor furniture that we never used, a garden area with plants whose names I didn't know, and a shed where Kenneth stored his golf clubs and lawn equipment. It was beautiful, magazine-worthy, and completely sterile. I finished my toast and went upstairs to get my laptop. I had college applications to work on, and the library would be quiet and warm, with free internet and no family members to remind me of my place in the hierarchy. But as I packed my backpack, I heard a car pulling into the driveway, then voices. Kenneth and Dylan were back, earlier than expected, and they sounded excited about something. I crept to my bedroom window and looked down. Kenneth was pulling bags from the trunk of his car while Dylan gestured animatedly. Through the glass I could hear fragments of their conversation. "Said you could start Monday if you want. Better than we hoped for. Your mother is going to be so proud." They disappeared into the house, and I heard them calling for Patricia. She must have come home early too, because within minutes, there was celebration happening downstairs. Voices overlapping, laughter, the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing. I sat on my bed and listened to my family celebrate something that didn't include me. Whatever Dylan had accomplished, whatever good news he was sharing, I would hear about it secondhand, if at all. 20 minutes later, the kitchen filled with the sound of sizzling and the smell of bacon. Apparently the good news warranted a second breakfast, a proper celebration meal. I heard Kenneth talking about breaking out the good champagne, Patricia suggesting they order pastries from the French bakery downtown. No one called upstairs to invite me to join them. I packed my backpack more deliberately, adding my notebook where I had started documenting things, my laptop charger, and a water bottle. The library would have to be my refuge today, a place where I could focus on my future instead of dwelling on my present. But as I reached for my bedroom door, I heard something that made me freeze. Problem is what to do about Natalie, Patricia was saying, her voice carrying clearly up the stair. I held my breath and moved closer to the stairwell, staying hidden but positioning myself where I could hear better. She's going to be 17 soon, Kenneth replied. Maybe it's time we had a conversation about expectations. I've been thinking the same thing, Patricia continued. Dylan's going to need support for this new opportunity, and honestly, we can't keep funding two kids' futures indefinitely. My heart started beating faster. They were talking about me like I was a budget line item that needed to be reduced. She's smart, Dylan said, and for a moment, I felt a flutter of hope. She can figure things out on her own. She's always been independent. Independent. The word they used when they meant neglected. The word that made abandonment sound like a positive character trait. Exactly, Kenneth agreed. We've given her a good foundation, now it's time for her to build her own life. I pressed my back against the wall, feeling dizzy. They were talking about cutting me off, not just from fancy dinners and good plates and equal portions, but from support entirely. When should we tell her? Patricia asked. Soon, Kenneth said. No point in waiting. Better she knows now so she can plan accordingly. I heard chairs scraping against the floor, the conversation moving toward the living room. I had heard enough anyway, more than enough. I grabbed my backpack and headed for my bedroom door, moving as quietly as possible. I needed to get out of this house before they decided to have their conversation with me right now, before I had time to process what I had just learned. The stairs seemed longer than usual, each step a careful calculation to avoid the creaks that would announce my presence. I could hear their voices in the living room, still discussing my future like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person who lived in this house. I made it to the front door without being detected, and slipped outside. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of burning leaves, and the promise of winter. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking toward downtown, toward the library, toward anywhere that wasn't home. But as I walked, the conversation I had overheard played on repeat in my mind. The casual way they had discussed cutting me off, as if it was inevitable and reasonable. The assumption that I would simply accept whatever they decide. The complete absence of any consideration for what I might want or need. By the time I reached the library, I had made a decision of my own. If they wanted to have a conversation about expectations, I would be ready for it, but it wouldn't be the conversation they were expecting. I found a quiet corner table and opened my laptop. The document I had started the night before, my record of neglect and inequality, was still there, but now it felt like something more than just personal therapy. It felt like evidence. I began typing again, adding what I had overheard this morning, but also expanding the scope of what I was documenting. Not just the unequal treatment, but the emotional impact. Not just the material differences, but the pattern of behavior that had shaped my entire childhood. As I wrote, other memories surfaced. The time I had food poisoning and spent the day vomiting while my parents took Dylan to see a movie he wanted to see, leaving me alone with crackers and ginger ale. The way they discussed family vacations around me, as if my presence was optional. The birthday parties where Dylan's friends were welcomed and entertained while mine were tolerated for exactly the amount of time politeness required. I wrote about school events, where they showed up for Dylan's basketball games, but missed my debate tournament. I wrote about the college visits they had planned for Dylan, complete with hotel reservations and restaurant recommendations, while expecting me to figure out my future with a bus pass and determination. The more I wrote, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't just about food or money, or attention. This was about systematic exclusion, a consistent message that my value was less than his, that my needs were secondary, that my future was my own problem to solve. But I was discovering something else as I wrote. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years was crystallizing into something more focused. more purposeful. I was not going to accept their conversation about expectations. I was going to change the terms entirely. I spent the entire day in the library, writing and researching and planning. When I finally looked up, it was nearly 6 o'clock, and the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the tall windows. I saved my work, closed my laptop, and gathered my things. It was time to go home. But this time I wasn't going home as the unwanted daughter who accepted whatever scraps were offered. I was going home as someone who had a plan. Walking back from the library, I noticed things I had never paid attention to before. Other families through lit windows, gathered around dinner tables, everyone with similar plates, similar portions. A mother helping her teenager with homework at the kitchen counter, a father teaching his daughter to change a tire in their driveway. Normal families doing normal things that looked nothing like my experience. The contrast made my chest tight with something I couldn't name. Not quite jealousy, not quite sadness, more like recognition of what I had been missing, without realizing I was missing it. When I reached our house on Maple Ridge Drive, every light was on. Through the front windows, I could see my family in the living room, Dylan gesturing excitedly while Kenneth and Patricia leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Whatever celebration had started this morning was still going strong. I used my key to enter through the front door, and the conversation stopped immediately. 3 faces turned toward me with expressions that ranged from mild annoyance to outright irritation, as if I had interrupted something important by existing in my own home. "There you are," Patricia said, her tone carrying that particular sharpness she reserved for when I had somehow inconvenienced her. "We've been waiting for you, waiting for me." The words should have felt welcoming, but the way she said them made it clear that my absence had been an obstacle to whatever they wanted to accomplish. "I was at the library," I said, setting my backpack down by the door. Kenneth asked, as if spending 8 hours studying was somehow unreasonable. I had work to do. Dylan was practically vibrating with excitement, clearly bursting to share whatever news had prompted the earlier celebration. "Tell her, Dad. Tell her what happened." Kenneth straightened up, putting on what I recognized as his important announcement voice. "Dylan has been offered a position with Morrison and Associates, full-time starting immediately, with a salary that frankly exceeded our expectations." Morrison and Associates was one of the most prestigious marketing firms in the state. I had heard Kenneth mention them before, always with the kind of reverence usually reserved for discussing celebrities. "That's great," I said, because it was expected. "Congratulations, Dylan." Dylan beamed. "Thanks. It's incredible, really. Mr. Morrison said he's never seen a portfolio from someone my age that impressed him so much, and the salary is enough that I can get my own place, maybe even that apartment complex downtown with the rooftop pool." "We're so proud," Patricia added, reaching over to squeeze Dylan's hand. "Our boy, making his mark on the world." I stood there, backpack still in hand, waiting for someone to ask about my day, or invite me to sit down or acknowledge that I was part of this family moment. But the conversation continued around me, as if I was a piece of furniture that happened to be in the room. "The thing is," Kenneth continued, and his tone shifted slightly, "this opportunity changes our family situation somewhat." There it was, the conversation I had overheard this morning, about to happen in real time. Dylan's going to need help with his transition. First month's rent, security deposit, professional wardrobe, that sort of thing. It's an investment in his future, but it's also a significant expense. I set my backpack down more carefully, buying myself time to prepare for whatever was coming next. Patricia jumped in, her voice taking on that artificially gentle tone she used when delivering bad news. "And with college costs looming for both of you, we've had to make some difficult decisions about resource allocation." Resource allocation. She was talking about her children like we were budget line items. "What kind of decisions?" I asked, though I already knew. Kenneth cleared his throat. "We've decided that it's time for you to take more responsibility for your own future. You're almost 18, you're clearly capable and independent, and honestly, we think it will be good for you to learn self-reliance." "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Patricia said, still using that gentle tone, "that after graduation, you'll be on your own financially. College, living expenses, everything. We've given you a good foundation, and now it's time for you to build on it." The room fell silent. Dylan was studying his hands, suddenly very interested in his cuticles. Kenneth was looking at me with the expression of someone who had just delivered difficult but necessary medicine. Patricia was smiling, that tight, sympathetic smile she used when she wanted to appear caring, while doing something cruel. "What about Dylan's college?" I asked. "You paid for 4 years at State University, plus his living expenses, plus his car, plus his study abroad program." "Dylan's situation was different," Kenneth said quickly. "He had clear career goals, excellent grades, leadership potential. It made sense to invest in his education. I have excellent grades too. I'm ranked 3rd in my class." "Academic achievement is wonderful," Patricia said, "but it's not the same as real-world potential. Dylan has always shown natural leadership abilities, networking skills, the kind of charisma that translates to success in business." I stared at her, processing what she had just said. My academic achievements, the things I had worked hardest for, the accomplishments that had given me the most pride, were being dismissed as irrelevant, because I wasn't charismatic enough to deserve investment. "So let me understand this correctly," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Dylan gets 4 years of college paid for, plus living expenses, plus career support, plus help transitioning to his new job, and I get told to figure it out myself because I don't have enough charisma." "That's not how we would phrase it," Kenneth said, but he didn't offer an alternative phrasing. "How would you phrase it?" The question hung in the air. Dylan was now actively avoiding eye contact. Patricia's smile was becoming more strained by the second. Kenneth was doing that thing where he straightened his tie even though he wasn't wearing one, a nervous habit that surfaced when he was uncomfortable. "We would say," Patricia finally answered, "that we're confident in your ability to succeed independently." "Based on what evidence?" "Based on the fact that you've always been self-sufficient, you've never needed as much attention or support as Dylan, you figure things out on your own." There it was again, independence, as a punishment, disguised as a compliment, self-sufficiency, as an excuse for neglect. "Maybe I never asked for attention because I learned early that I wouldn't get it," I said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Kenneth's jaw tightened. Patricia's smile disappeared entirely. Dylan looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. "That's unfair, Natalie," Patricia said, her voice no longer gentle. "We've provided for you your entire life. You've had food, shelter, clothing, education. Many children would be grateful for what you've received." "Food," I repeated. "Like tonight when you all went out for second breakfast to celebrate Dylan's news while I was at the library. You weren't here," Kenneth said defensively. "You didn't invite me. You didn't even tell me there was something to celebrate." "You've always preferred to do your own thing," Patricia said. "We didn't want to interrupt your library time." I looked around the room at my family, really looked at them. Kenneth's successful and confident, and completely unable to understand why his daughter might want to be included in family celebrations. Patricia, socially conscious and charity-minded, and utterly blind to the inequality in her own home. Dylan, talented and charming and so accustomed to being the center of attention that he couldn't conceive of sharing it. "I'm going to my room," I said. "We're not finished with this conversation," Kenneth called after me. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned back. "Yes, we are." "You've made your decision. You're cutting me off financially, after graduation." Message received. "Natalie," Patricia started, but I was already climbing the stairs. In my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation had gone exactly as I had expected, but somehow it still felt like a punch to the gut. Hearing them say out loud that they considered Dylan worthy of investment while I was expected to fend for myself. Seeing the casual way they discussed destroying my future plans, watching them smile while they delivered the news like it was a gift rather than an abandonment. I opened my laptop and pulled up the document I had been working on, the evidence file. I added today's conversation, typing out as much of the dialogue as I could remember word for word. The resource allocation comment. the charisma explanation, the way they had framed independence as something I had chosen rather than something that had been forced on me. But as I wrote, I realized something important. I wasn't just documenting their behavior anymore. I was building a case. Over the next few days, I paid attention differently. Instead of just enduring the inequality, I started recording it, not just in my laptop, but with my phone's camera and voice recorder. Tuesday evening, I filmed them preparing dinner from the top of the stairs. Kenneth grilling steaks for himself, Patricia and Dylan while opening a can of soup for me. The visual was stark, 3 thick cuts of meat, sizzling on the grill while I got Campbell's chicken noodle from a can. Wednesday morning, I recorded the breakfast conversation where they discussed Dylan's apartment hunting, debating the merits of different neighborhoods and amenities, while I ate cereal from a bowl with a chip in it, and they didn't even acknowledge my presence at the table. Thursday night, I captured audio of them planning Dylan's going-away party, a celebration for his new job that would involve catering from his favorite restaurant and invitations to all the family friends. When Dylan suggested they should do something nice for me too, since I was graduating soon, Patricia's response was telling. Natalie doesn't really enjoy parties. She's more of a quiet, private person. I think she'd prefer something low-key. Low-key meaning nothing. Private meaning ignored. It was fascinating, in a horrible way, how they had created an entire narrative about my personality that justified their neglect. By Friday, I had hours of footage and audio. Clear, undeniable documentation of favoritism so blatant, it was almost cartoonish. But I still needed more. I needed proof that this wasn't just emotional neglect, but something that crossed legal lines. That proof came Saturday morning, in the form of a phone call. I was in my room, working on college applications that I now knew I would have to fund entirely myself, when I heard Patricia on the phone downstairs. She was talking to someone about Dylan's party, discussing catering options and guest lists. "Oh, we're so excited for him," she was saying. "Kenneth and I always knew he'd be successful, even when he was little. Some children just have that spark, you know, they're natural leaders, natural winners." I crept to the top of the stairs to hear better. Natalie, oh, she's fine. Very independent. Very self-sufficient. She's actually moving out after graduation, which is probably for the best. Teenagers need their space. And honestly, it will be nice to have the house to ourselves again. Moving out after graduation, they had already decided this, already told people about it, without bothering to inform me in college. Oh, she'll figure something out. She's very resourceful. Not like Dylan, who needs more support and guidance. But some kids are just born self-reliant. I listened to her spin my forced independence as a positive trait for another 10 minutes before the conversation ended. But it was what happened next that gave me the evidence I really needed. Patricia called Kenneth, who was apparently at the golf course. "I was just talking to Margaret about the party. She asked about Natalie's plans, and I realized we should probably make this official sooner rather than later." Official. My stomach dropped. I know we talked about waiting until after graduation, but honestly, it might be better to get the legal paperwork done now. If we formally terminate our financial responsibility while she's still 17, it establishes a clear boundary. Otherwise, there might be questions about why we're not supporting her college expenses. Legal paperwork. They were talking about legally disowning. "I'll call Harrison on Monday." Kenneth's voice came through the phone speaker. "Harrison Webb, their lawyer. He can draw up whatever we need to sign. Emancipation papers. I think they're called. Perfect. And this way, when people ask why we're not helping with college, we can just say she's legally independent." It sounds much better than saying we chose not to support her. They were going to legally abandon me to avoid social embarrassment about not paying for my college. I sat on the stairs, phone in hand, recording every word of their conversation. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was legal abandonment of a minor for financial convenience. After they hung up, I stayed on the stairs for a long time, processing what I had just heard. They weren't just cutting me off, they were going to make it legal, official, permanent. and they were going to do it in a way that protected their reputation while destroying my future. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed I would accept this passively, the way I had accepted everything else for 17 years. They were wrong. I spent the rest of Saturday researching emancipation laws, parents' legal obligations to minor children, and what constituted child neglect in our state. What I found was illuminating. Providing significantly different standards of care for children in the same household could constitute neglect, especially if one child's basic needs were being met, while another's were not. Emotional abandonment, when combined with material deprivation, could be grounds for intervention by Child Protective Services. Most importantly, parents could not simply decide to emancipate a minor without the minor's consent, and without proving that emancipation was in the child's best interest. It wasn't something they could just sign papers for because it was convenient. Sunday morning, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. I called the Child Protective Services hotline. The woman who answered was kind but professional. She listened as I explained my situation, asked clarifying questions about the differences in treatment, and took notes about the planned legal abandonment. "Can you document any of this?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I have video, audio recordings, and written documentation going back several days, plus witnesses who have seen the different treatment." Witnesses? I thought about Mrs. Kim, our neighbor who had commented more than once about how thin I was compared to Dylan. About Principal Foster who had asked if everything was okay at home when I showed up to school events alone while Dylan always had family support. About Aunt Rosa, my father's sister who lived across town and who I hadn't spoken to in months, because Patricia had gradually cut her out of our lives, after she asked too many questions about why I looked so tired all the time. "Yes," I said. "I have witnesses, or I'm going to open a case file and assign an investigator. Someone will contact you within 48 hours to set up an interview. In the meantime, document everything you can, but don't put yourself in any danger." It hadn't occurred to me that my parents might become dangerous if they discovered what I was doing, but as I hung up the phone, I realized that everything was about to change, and not just for me. Monday morning, I went to school as usual, but everything felt different. I sat through classes thinking about case files and investigations, and legal consequences. I ate lunch alone, as always, but this time it felt like a choice rather than an abandonment. After school, instead of going home, I walked to the small coffee shop where Aunt Rosa worked part-time. I hadn't seen her in almost a year, not since Patricia had decided that Rosa was a negative influence, who asked too many questions, and stirred up unnecessary drama. Rosa looked surprised when I walked in, but her face immediately softened with concern. "Natalie, honey, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," I said, "about our family." She glanced around the nearly empty coffee shop, then nodded toward a corner table. "Let me grab some coffee and we'll talk." Rosa had always been different from the rest of my father's family. Where Kenneth was formal and distant, Rosa was warm and direct. Where the Brooks family prized appearance and success above all else, Rosa cared about authenticity and kindness. "You look thin," she said as soon as we sat down. "Are you eating?" It was such a simple question, but it hit me like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had asked if I was eating enough? When was the last time anyone had looked at me and been concerned about my well-being? "Sometimes," I said, and then, without meaning to, I started crying. Rosa reached across the table and took my hand. "Tell me what's happening." So I did. I told her about the leftover dinners while my family ate restaurant food. I told her about the college conversation, about being cut off financially, about the plan to legally emancipate me. I told her about years of feeling invisible in my own home, about being raised as an afterthought, while Dylan was raised as a prince. Rosa listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail I shared. "I knew something was wrong," she said, when I finished. "Every time I saw you at family gatherings, you looked like you were shrinking. But when I tried to talk to Kenneth about it, Patricia always had an explanation. You were shy, you were independent, you preferred to be left alone. They've convinced everyone that I'm just naturally quiet and self-sufficient." "Bullshit," Rosa said, and her vehemence surprised me. "I remember you as a little girl. You were bright and curious and social. You loved being around people. What they did to you, making you believe you were meant to be alone. That's not natural development. That's conditioning." She paused, studying my face carefully. "What are you planning to do about this?" "I've already done it," I said. "I called Child Protective Services yesterday." Rosa's eyebrows shot up. "Good for you. Good for me, Natalie. What your parents are doing isn't just mean, it's illegal. Parents have legal obligations to provide equal care for all their children. They can't decide that one kid deserves filet mignon while the other gets leftover. They can't choose to fund one child's future while forcing the other into poverty. But I'm almost 18, you're 17, you're still a minor, still their legal responsibility. And what they're planning with this emancipation nonsense, that's not how the law works. They can't just abandon you because it's financially convenient." I felt a weight lifting from my chest that I hadn't even realized was there. For so long I had accepted my parents' narrative that this was normal, that I was different, that I deserved less. Hearing Rosa name it as illegal, as wrong, as something that could be challenged, felt like waking up from a nightmare. "Will you help me?" I asked. "Honey, I'll do whatever you need." That evening, I went home to find the family in crisis mode. Kenneth was pacing the living room while Patricia sat on the couch with her phone, making rapid calls to people whose names I didn't recognize. "Where have you been?" Kenneth demanded when I walked in. "At school, then the library." "Don't lie to us, Natalie. We know you haven't been at the library every day this week." My heart started beating faster. How did they know where I had been? "We called the library," Patricia said, hanging up her phone. "They said you haven't been there since Saturday." I had underestimated them. Of course they would check up on me when it suited their needs. "I went to see Aunt Rosa," I said, deciding that honesty was the better strategy at this point. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Kenneth's face turned red. Patricia stood up so fast she knocked over her water glass. Dylan, who had been quiet until now, looked between all of us like he was watching a tennis match. "I told you to stay away from her," Patricia snapped. "That woman is poison. She fills your head with nonsense and makes you think you have something to complain about. Or maybe she's the only person who's ever asked if I'm eating enough." "Don't be dramatic." "Dramatic?" I pulled out my phone and opened the recording app. "Is it dramatic when you discuss legally abandoning me to avoid paying for college? Is it dramatic when you provide Dylan with steak dinners while giving me canned soup?" Kenneth's eyes narrowed. "Have you been recording us?" "Yes." The admission hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. "That's illegal," Patricia said quickly. "Recording people without their consent." "Actually, it's not. Oregon is a one-party consent state. As long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, it's legal." I had done my research. Kenneth and Patricia exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret, but it made my skin crawl. "Go to your room," Kenneth said, his voice deadly calm. "We'll discuss this in the morning." I had planned to argue, to stand my ground, to use this moment to confront them about everything. But something about Kenneth's tone, about the way Patricia was looking at me, made me think that retreat was the wiser option. "Fine," I said, and headed for the stairs. But as I reached my room, I heard them talking in urgent whispers downstairs. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. They were making plans, and those plans involved me. I locked my bedroom door and sat on my bed with my laptop, reviewing everything I had documented over the past week. Hours of audio and video evidence, written testimony from Rose, research about legal obligations and child welfare laws. Tomorrow a Child Protective Services investigator would contact me. Within a few days, someone would come to the house to interview my family and assess the situation. Kenneth and Patricia clearly suspected that something was happening, but they didn't know how far it had already gone. I saved all my files to a cloud storage account and made backup copies on a flash drive that I hid in my backpack. If they tried to take my laptop or phone, the evidence would still exist. Then I did something I had never done before. I called Rosa and asked if I could stay at her apartment if I needed to. "Of course," she said immediately. "Do you think you're in danger?" I thought about the look in Kenneth's eyes, about the whispered conversation downstairs, about 17 years of being treated as expendable. "I don't know," I said, but I want to be prepared. As I settled into bed that night, I realized that everything had changed. I was no longer the invisible daughter who accepted whatever scraps were offered. I was no longer the problem to be solved or the burden to be discarded. I was someone who had decided to fight back, and tomorrow the real battle would begin. Tuesday morning came with an unexpected twist. I woke to the smell of bacon and pancakes, the kind of elaborate breakfast that Kenneth usually reserved for special occasions, or when he was feeling guilty about something. When I came downstairs, the entire family was gathered around the kitchen table with enough food to feed twice our number. "Morning, sweetheart," Patricia said with a brightness that felt forced. "Perfect timing. We made your favorite blueberry pancakes." Favorite? I had never expressed a preference for blueberry pancake. In fact, I wasn't even sure Patricia knew what my actual favorite foods were, since she rarely asked and I was rarely given choices. Kenneth was at the stove, flipping what looked like the largest batch of pancakes he'd ever made. Dylan was setting the table with the good china, the plates we usually only used for company. Everything about the scene felt like a performance, but I couldn't figure out who the audience was supposed to be. Sit, Patricia urged, pulling out a chair for me. Not my usual seat at the end of the table, but one of the middle chairs, right between her and Dylan. I sat, suspicious but curious about where this was heading. Kenneth appeared with a plate piled high with pancakes, 3 thick golden circles studded with berries, accompanied by crispy bacon and fresh strawberries. It was easily twice as much food as I normally got at breakfast, presented with the kind of care usually reserved for Dylan's meal. "Here we go," Kenneth said, setting the plate in front of me, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Eat up." Patricia poured fresh orange juice into a real glass, not the plastic cup I usually got. Dylan passed me the butter and syrup without being asked. The whole thing felt surreal, like I had woken up in someone else's family. "So," Patricia said, cutting her own pancakes with deliberate precision, "we've been thinking about our conversation yesterday." "Here it comes," I thought. "We realize we may have come across as harsh," Kenneth continued. "That wasn't our intention at all." Dylan nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, we were just trying to discuss practical matters, but we didn't explain ourselves very well." I took a bite of pancakes, which were admittedly delicious, and waited for them to get to the point. "The truth is," Patricia said, "we're incredibly proud of you. Your independence, your academic achievements, your maturity. We sometimes forget that you're still our little girl who needs support and encouragement." Little girl. I was 17 years old and had been managing my own meals, laundry and homework without help since I was 12. "We want to make sure you know that we'll always be here for you," Kenneth added. "College, career, whatever you need, we're a family, and family supports each other." The whiplash was incredible. Yesterday they had been discussing legal emancipation and resource allocation. Today they were promising lifelong support, and calling me their little girl. "That's nice to hear," I said carefully. "We were thinking," Dylan jumped in, "maybe we should plan something special for your graduation, a party or a trip, or something to celebrate your achievements." A graduation party? For me, the girl who supposedly preferred low-key private celebrations. "What brought this on?" I asked. The three of them exchanged glances, and I saw something pass between them. Some kind of understanding or agreement that didn't include me. "We just realized we haven't been as attentive as we should be," Patricia said. "You know how busy life gets." Kenneth's work, Dylan's job transition, my volunteer commitments. Sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You know, the squeaky wheel, as if my years of silence had been a choice rather than learned helplessness. "But we want to do better," Kenneth said. "Starting now." I finished my pancakes, taking time to think about this sudden transformation. The timing was suspicious, coming immediately after they discovered I had been recording them and visiting Rose. Either they had experienced a miraculous change of heart overnight, or they were trying to manage a situation they perceived as threatening. "I appreciate that," I said, "but I'm curious about something. Yesterday you mentioned calling Harrison about legal paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" Another exchange of glances, quicker this time. "Oh, that," Patricia waved her hand, dismissively. "That was just us being overly cautious about financial planning. making sure all our ducks are in a row for tax purposes. Nothing that affects you directly. Tax purposes, right. So you're not planning to pursue emancipation. Kenneth's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Emancipation? Where did you get that idea? From your phone conversation yesterday. The one where you discussed terminating your financial responsibility while I'm still 17 to establish clear boundaries. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down. Dylan suddenly became very interested in his napkin. Kenneth cleared his throat twice before speaking. I think you may have misunderstood what you heard, he said finally. I recorded it. Another silence, longer this time. Natalie, Patricia said, and her voice had lost all its artificial warmth. This habit of recording private family conversations needs to stop. It's invasive and inappropriate. What's inappropriate is planning to abandon your minor child for financial convenience. No one is abandoning anyone, Kenneth said sharply. We're having normal family discussions about expectations and responsibilities. Normal families don't provide restaurant meals for some children while giving others canned soup. You're exaggerating. I have video evidence. Dylan spoke up for the first time since the conversation had turned serious. Maybe we could all just calm down and talk about this rationally. I looked at my brother, really looked at him. At 19 he was handsome in the conventional way that made people like him immediately. He had Kenneth's strong jaw and Patricia's expressive eyes, plus a natural charisma that had always opened doors for him. But right now he looked uncomfortable, like someone who had been forced to participate in something he didn't fully understand. Dylan, I said, do you think it's fair that Mom and Dad paid for your entire college education while planning to cut me off financially the day I graduate? He shifted in his seat. I think everyone's situation is different. How is mine different? Well, you're more independent. You've always been good at taking care of yourself. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I learned to take care of myself because I had to? Dylan frowned, like this was a new concept he hadn't considered before. You've never had to worry about whether there would be enough food at dinner, I continued. You've never had to sit at a different table or eat from chipped dishes or watch your parents celebrate your siblings' achievements while ignoring your own. That's not how I remember it, Dylan said, but his voice lacked conviction. That's because you were the one getting celebrated. Kenneth slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. Enough, this conversation is getting out of hand. The conversation got out of hand when you decided to legally abandon me. We are not abandoning you, Patricia said, through gritted teeth. We are trying to teach you responsibility and independence by cutting off my access to food, shelter, and education, by helping you learn to stand on your own 2 feet. The circular logic was maddening. They had created the conditions that forced me to be independent, then used my independence as justification for withdrawing support, then framed the withdrawal of support as helping me learn independence. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it quickly and felt my heart rate spike. The message was from a number I didn't recognize. This is Maria Santos from Child Protective Services. I've been assigned to your case. Can you meet today at 3 p.m. at the Riverside Community Center? Please confirm. I looked up to find 3 pairs of eyes watching me intently. Who's texting you? Patricia asked. A friend from school. What friend? Does it matter? Kenneth's eyes narrowed. Everything matters when you're living under our roof. Our roof. Not my roof. Not the family roof. Their roof, which I was apparently occupying by their grace, rather than by right. I stood up from the table. Thank you for breakfast. It was surprisingly good. Where are you going? Patricia demanded. School. It's still early. I have things to do. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door, but Kenneth's voice stopped me. Natalie, I turned back. I meant what I said about families supporting each other. But support goes both ways. Loyalty goes both ways. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Support me, be loyal to me, or face the consequences. I understand. But what I understood was that they knew something was happening, and they were trying to control it before it spiraled beyond their reach. At school, I couldn't concentrate on anything. Classes passed in a blur of half-heard lectures and assignments I couldn't focus on. During lunch, I sat in the library and researched what to expect from a CPS interview, what questions they might ask, what evidence would be most compelling. The more I read, the more I realized how serious this was becoming. Child Protective Services investigations weren't casual inquiries. They had the power to remove children from homes, to mandate family therapy, to involve law enforcement if they found evidence of abuse or neglect. I also learned that once an investigation began, it had to be completed regardless of what the family wanted. Kenneth and Patricia couldn't simply charm their way out of this or promise to do better. There would be interviews, home visits, documentation reviews, and possibly court hearings. By the time 3 p.m. arrived, I was nervous but determined. The Riverside Community Center was a generic municipal building with fluorescent lighting and industrial carpeting, the kind of place where boring but important business got conducted. Maria Santos was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s. With kind eyes and a professional manner that put me somewhat at ease. She led me to a small conference room with a table, 2 chairs and a box of tissues prominently displayed. "Thank you for meeting with me, Natalie," she said, pulling out a notepad and digital recorder. "I want to start by explaining what this process looks like, and what your rights are." She explained that anything I said would be documented and could potentially be used in legal proceedings. She explained that I could have a support person present if I wanted, and that I could stop the interview at any time. She explained that her job was to assess whether I is safe and whether my basic needs were being met. "Do you feel safe in your home?" she asked. It was such a simple question, but it took me a long time to answer. "Physically safe, yes. Emotionally safe, no." "Can you explain the difference?" I told her about 17 years of systematic favoritism, about feeling invisible in my own family, about being conditioned to expect less and ask for nothing. I showed her the videos I had taken, the audio recordings of conversations about abandoning me. I explained about the planned emancipation and what I had overheard about avoiding college expenses. Maria took notes and asked clarifying questions. She asked about specific incidents, about patterns of behavior, about how the differential treatment affected my daily life and emotional well-being. "Do you have any witnesses to this treatment?" she asked. "My Aunt Rosa. She's noticed the differences and has expressed concern. Also, some teachers at school have asked if everything is okay at home. I'll need contact information for these people." I gave her Rosa's phone number and the names of 2 teachers who had shown concern about my weight loss and frequent absences from family events that other students' parents attended. "What would you like to see happen as a result of this investigation?" Maria asked. I had been thinking about this question for days. I want them to be held accountable for their actions. I want there to be consequences for treating their children unequally. And I want protection for myself while I finish high school and figure out my future. "What kind of protection?" "I want to live somewhere safe where I'm treated like a person instead of a burden. I want access to the same opportunities that Dylan has had. I want to finish my education without worrying about whether I'll have food or shelter." Maria nodded and made more notes. "I need to be direct with you about something," she said. "Based on what you've told me and the evidence you've provided, I'm going to recommend that we move forward with a formal investigation. This will involve interviewing your parents and brother, inspecting your living conditions, and reviewing any relevant documents." My stomach flipped. "When?" "I'll be contacting your parents today to schedule a home visit. They'll be notified that an investigation is underway. Will they know I'm the one who reported them? They'll be told that a report was made expressing concerns about the welfare of a minor in the home. The specific source of the report is confidential, but given the circumstances, they may draw their own conclusion." I thought about Kenneth's threat at breakfast, about the sudden shift in their behavior, about the way they had watched me during our conversation this morning. "I'm concerned about their reaction," I said. "Do you believe they would retaliate against you?" "I don't know. They've never been physically abusive, but they have ways of making life unpleasant when they're angry." Maria's expression grew more serious. "If you feel unsafe at any point, I want you to call me immediately. If you feel like you're in immediate danger, call 911. She gave me her business card with her cell phone number written on the back. "I'm also going to give you information about emergency placement options. just in case. Do you have somewhere you could stay temporarily if needed? My Aunt Rosa. Good. Make sure she knows she might need to provide temporary housing on short notice. We talked for another 30 minutes about logistics and next steps. Maria would contact my school to verify my academic performance and speak with teachers about any concerns they had observed. She would interview Rosa about her observations of family dynamics. She would review any medical records to look for signs of neglect or malnutrition. Most importantly, she would conduct an unannounced home visit within the next 48 hours to observe the family's living situation and interview each member separately. One more thing, Maria said as we prepared to leave. You did the right thing by calling. I know this feels overwhelming, but advocating for yourself takes courage. Many young people in your situation suffer in silence because they don't know they have options. I walked home from the community center feeling like I was carrying a bomb that could explode at any moment. By this evening, Kenneth and Patricia would know that Child Protective Services was investigating them. They would know that their carefully constructed narrative about family dynamics was being scrutinized by professionals trained to identify abuse and neglect. The house was quiet when I arrived. Too quiet. Usually there were sounds of dinner preparation or television or conversation. Today there was nothing. I found them in the living room, sitting in a formation that looked like they had been waiting for me. Kenneth was in his reading chair, Patricia was on the couch, and Dylan was perched on the edge of the ottoman. All three were staring at the front door when I walked in. Sit down, Natalie, Kenneth said. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl. I remained standing. Is everything okay? That depends, Patricia said. We received an interesting phone call this afternoon. My heart started pounding, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. Oh? From someone named Maria Santos. From Child Protective Service. The words hung in the air like an accusation. She wants to schedule a home visit to discuss concerns about the welfare of a minor in our household. I said nothing. Apparently someone has made allegations about our parenting, Kenneth continued. Allegations about neglect and differential treatment of our children. Still, I said nothing. Now, we can't imagine who would make such allegations, Patricia said, her voice dripping with false confusion. Because anyone who knows our family knows that we've always provided for both our children equally. So we're hoping, Kenneth said, that you might have some insight into how these misunderstandings arose. They knew, of course they knew, but they wanted me to confess, to admit what I had done so they could respond accordingly. I have no idea, I said. Kenneth's jaw tightened. Natalie, this is serious. False allegations against parents can have severe consequences. People lose their jobs, their reputations, their family. Then it's good that they're only investigating true allegations. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Are you saying, Patricia asked slowly, that you believe these allegations are true? I'm saying that if CPS is investigating, they must have good reason. Dylan finally spoke up. Natalie, just tell us if you called them. This isn't helping anyone. I looked at my brother, who had always been given everything he wanted without question, who had never had to fight for basic consideration, who genuinely seemed to believe that our family's dysfunction was normal. Would it matter if I did? Of course it would matter, Kenneth said. We could explain the misunderstandings, clear up any confusion before this gets out of hand. What misunderstandings? The idea that we treat you differently than Dylan. You do treat me differently than Dylan. We treat you according to your individual needs and personality. Dylan's individual needs include steak dinners and college tuition. Mine include leftover casserole and financial abandonment. That's not fair, Patricia said. Dylan has always been more social, more ambitious. He needs more support to reach his potential. And what's my potential? You're very capable and independent, so my potential is to need less and expect nothing. Your potential is to succeed on your own merits instead of relying on handout. The logic was insane, but they delivered it with such conviction that I could almost understand how they had convinced themselves it made sense. The CPS investigator is going to ask you about these things, I said, about the different food, the different support, the different expectation. What are you going to tell her? Kenneth and Patricia exchanged a look. We're going to tell her the truth, Kenneth said, that we have 2 children with different personalities and different needs, and we parent them accordingly. And when she asks to see videos of family dinner, another look. What videos? Patricia asked. The ones where Dylan gets restaurant food while I get leftovers. The ones where you discuss my future like I'm not in the room. The ones where you plan to legally abandon me for financial convenience. Those videos were taken without consent, Kenneth said. Quickly, they're inadmissible. Actually, they're not. Oregon is a one-party consent state for recording. I had done my homework. The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. We all froze, looking at each other like deer caught in headlights. I'll get it, Dylan said. Jumping up, through the living room window I could see a woman in a business suit standing on our front porch with a clipboard and an official-looking bag. Maria Santos had decided not to wait 48 hours. Dylan opened the door, and Maria's voice carried clearly into the living room. Good evening, I'm Maria Santos, from Child Protective Services. I believe my supervisor called earlier to schedule a home visit. Kenneth and Patricia looked at each other with expressions of pure panic. Actually, Maria continued, I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see if now might be convenient. Unannounced home visits were standard procedure for CPS investigation. They gave families no time to prepare, no opportunity to stage normal behavior or hide evidence of problems. Kenneth stood up slowly and walked to the front door. Of course, please come in. Maria entered our house like a detective examining a crime scene, taking note of everything. The expensive furniture in the living room, the family photos on the mantelpiece that prominently featured Dylan while including me as an afterthought, the general atmosphere of tension that had settled over us like fog. I'll need to speak with each family member individually, Maria said, as well as observe the general living conditions. Shall we start with the parents? For the next 3 hours, Maria conducted the most thorough examination of our family that had ever occurred. She interviewed Kenneth and Patricia in the dining room while the rest of us waited in the living room, straining to hear fragments of conversation through the closed door. She interviewed Dylan in the kitchen, asking him questions about family dynamics and whether he had observed any differences in how his parents treated their children. She interviewed me in my bedroom, taking notes about the sparse furnishings, the mismatched furniture, the general atmosphere of neglect compared to Dylan's professionally decorated room down the hall. She examined our refrigerator and pantry, noting the abundance of expensive foods and wine alongside the small section of basic staples that constituted my usual meal option. She asked to see family financial records, college savings accounts, and documentation of expenses related to each child's care and education. By the time she finished, it was almost 9 o'clock, and the evidence of systematic favoritism was overwhelming and undeniable. I'll be in touch within 24 hours with my initial findings, Maria told Kenneth and Patricia at the front door. In the meantime, I strongly recommend that you consider how to address the disparities in treatment that we've discussed tonight. After she left, the house fell into a silence so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Kenneth and Patricia looked like they had aged 10 years in 3 hours. Dylan looked confused and shaken, as if someone had explained to him that everything he believed about his family was wrong. Well, Kenneth said finally, I hope you're satisfied. I'm not satisfied, I said, but I'm hopeful. Hopeful about what? That for the first time in my life, someone is going to hold you accountable for your choices. Patricia started crying then, quiet tears that she tried to hide behind her hands. We love you, she said. You're our daughter. We've always loved you. Love isn't just a feeling, I said. It's actions. It's choices. It's treating someone like they matter. You do matter. Then prove it. I left them in the living room and went upstairs to my room, where I packed a bag with essential items and called Rosa to let her know I might need to stay with her soon. Tomorrow, Maria Santos would submit her report. Tomorrow, my family would have to face the consequences of 17 years of choices that had left one child flourishing and the other fighting for survival. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, for the first time in my life, I felt like someone was finally listening. The call came at 7 in the morning. 2 days after Maria's visit, I was barely awake when my phone rang. But Maria's voice cut through the fog of sleep like a knife through butter. Natalie, I need you to listen carefully. Based on my investigation, I'm recommending immediate removal from your current living situation. Can you be ready to leave within the hour? My heart hammered against my ribs. What happened? I'll explain everything when I see you, but right now I need to know if you have a safe place to go. You mentioned your Aunt Rosa? Yes, she said I could stay with her anytime. Good, pack only what you absolutely need. I'm sending a police escort to ensure your safe removal from the premises. Police escort, the words sounded surreal. Like something that happened to other people in other families. Not to me in my quiet suburban house on Maple Ridge Drive. Should I tell my parents? No, we'll handle that. Just pack your essentials and be ready to leave when the officers arrive. I hung up and sat on my bed for a moment, trying to process what was happening. After 17 years of feeling trapped and invisible, I was about to walk out of this house under police protection. Part of me felt vindicated, another part felt terrified. I threw clothes into a duffel bag, grabbed my laptop and school supplies, and packed the few personal items that actually mattered to me. It wasn't much. Most of my belongings were hand-me-downs or cheap replacements for things Dylan had received new. There wasn't much worth keeping. Downstairs I could hear the family's morning routine begin. Kenneth's shower running, Patricia starting the coffee maker, Dylan's alarm clock going off for the third time. Normal sounds of a normal morning. Except nothing about this morning was normal. 20 minutes later, I heard cars pulling into our driveway. Not one car but several. I looked out my bedroom window and felt my stomach drop. 2 police cruisers sat in our driveway alongside Maria's sedan, and another official-looking vehicle I didn't recognize. Officers in uniform were getting out of their cars, along with Maria and a man in a suit who carried himself like someone with authority. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by loud knocking. Police, open the door please. I heard Kenneth's footsteps running down the stairs, then the sound of the front door opening. Officers, I think there's been some mistake. Kenneth's voice carried up the stairwell. We weren't expecting anyone this morning. Mr. Brooks, I'm Detective Johnson with Riverside County Police. We're here to execute a removal order for Natalie Brooks. Is she currently in the residence? A removal order? I don't understand. Child Protective Services has determined that the minor is at risk in this environment. We're here to ensure her safe transition to alternative housing. I heard Patricia's voice join the conversation, high-pitched and panicked. Risk? What risk? She's perfectly safe here. This is her home. Ma'am, if you could please step aside. We need to locate the minor and assist with her departure. I grabbed my bags and walked downstairs, where I found our front hallway filled with official personnel. Kenneth and Patricia stood pressed against the wall looking like they had been hit by a truck. Dylan appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, staring down at the scene with his mouth open. Natalie, Maria said when she saw me, are you ready? Yes. Kenneth stepped forward. Wait, just wait. Surely, we can discuss this like reasonable adults. Whatever misunderstanding has occurred, I'm confident we can resolve it without involving law enforcement. Detective Johnson consulted a tablet he was carrying. Mr. Brooks, are you Kenneth Michael Brooks, father of the minor Natalie Brooks? Yes. And you are Patricia Lynn Brooks, also parent of the minor. Patricia nodded, too shocked to speak. I need to inform you both that you're under arrest for child neglect and endangerment. The words hit the hallway like a bomb. Kenneth's face went white. Patricia made a sound like air being let out of a balloon. Dylan gripped the stair railing so hard his knuckles turned white. Under arrest, Kenneth's voice cracked. For what exactly? Child neglect in the first degree, emotional abuse of a minor, and conspiracy to abandon a dependent child. You have the right to remain silent. Detective Johnson continued reading them their rights while another officer approached with handcuffs. The scene felt like something from a television show, surreal and distant, as if I was watching it happen to someone else's family. This is insane, Patricia said, her voice rising to near hysteria. We've never hurt her. We've provided for her every day of her life. Ma'am, please put your hands behind your back. We gave her food, shelter, clothing, education. How is that neglect? Maria stepped forward with a folder in her hands. Mrs. Brooks, providing substandard care while giving preferential treatment to another child constitutes neglect under state law. Systematically providing one child with restaurant meals while giving another leftovers, planning to abandon a minor for financial convenience, and creating an emotionally hostile environment all qualify as abuse and neglect. But she's independent. She's always been self-sufficient. A child cannot be inherently self-sufficient. Mrs. Brooks, children learn to be self-sufficient when their basic needs for attention and care are not met, what you call independence. The state calls learned helplessness, resulting from parental neglect. I watched my parents being handcuffed in our front hallway, and the emotion I felt was not satisfaction or revenge, it was something closer to relief. Relief that someone with authority was finally naming what had happened to me. Relief that 17 years of gaslighting and minimization were being recognized as the serious crimes they actually were. Dylan, Patricia called out as the officers prepared to escort her to their car. Dylan, call Harrison immediately, tell him what's happened. Dylan nodded, still frozen on the stairs, and call your Uncle Robert, tell him we need help. Kenneth was being led toward the front door when he turned back to look at me. I hope you realize what you've done, he said. You've destroyed this family over nothing, over nothing. Even now, even being arrested, even facing legal consequences for 17 years of systematic abuse, he still believed that my suffering was nothing. The family was already destroyed, I said. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. After my parents were loaded into police cars and driven away, the house fell into an eerie quiet. Dylan came downstairs and stood in the living room, looking lost and confused. I don't understand what just happened, he said. Maria, who had stayed behind to oversee my transition, looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. Your parents have been systematically neglecting your sister while providing preferential treatment to you. The state considers this a form of child abuse. But they took care of both of us, did they? Have you ever eaten leftover casserole while your family had restaurant food? Dylan thought about this. No. Have you ever been excluded from family celebrations or had your achievements ignored? No. Have your parents ever threatened to cut you off financially or discussed legally abandoning you? No. But Natalie is different. She's always been more independent. Maria opened her folder and pulled out several photographs she had taken during her home visit. Photos of my sparse bedroom compared to Dylan's decorated space. Photos of the refrigerator showing expensive foods alongside basic staples. Photos of family pictures where I appeared as an afterthought. Independence is a choice, Maria said. What happened to your sister was not independence. It was systematic exclusion that forced her to learn survival skills at an abnormally young age. Dylan studied the photos, and I saw something shift in his expression. For the first time, he was seeing our family dynamic from the outside, through someone else's eye. I never realized, he said quietly. Most favored children don't, Maria replied. The system benefits them, so they don't question it. I felt a moment of something that might have been forgiveness toward Dylan. He had been as conditioned as I had, just in the opposite direction. Where I had learned to expect nothing, he had learned to expect everything. Neither of us had chosen our roles in the family drama. What happens now? Dylan asked. Natalie will stay with her aunt while the legal proceedings continue. Your parents will likely be released on bail within 24 hours. But they'll face criminal charges. There will be court hearings, probably family therapy requirements, and definitely ongoing supervision. And what about me? You're 19, and legally independent. This doesn't directly affect you unless you choose to get involved. Dylan looked at me then. Really, looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. I'm sorry, he said. I never knew it was this bad. I know, I said. They were good at hiding it. We loaded my bags into Maria's car, and I took one last look at the house where I had spent 17 years learning that I didn't matter. It looked smaller than I remembered,
less impressive, just a regular suburban house where extraordinary cruelty had been disguised as normal family life. Rosa's apartment was across town in a complex that had seen better days but was clean and well maintained. She had been expecting us, and had already prepared the small guest room with fresh sheets and a vase of flowers on the nightstand. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she said, hugging me tight. "For as long as you need." Home. The word hit me differently than it ever had before. Not a place where I was tolerated or ignored, but a place where I was wanted. Maria spent an hour explaining the legal process to both Rosa and me. There would be a preliminary hearing within the week, where my parents would be formally charged. There would be ongoing hearings as the case progressed through the system. I would likely need to testify about my experiences, which meant reliving 17 years of systematic neglect in front of strangers. "It won't be easy," Maria warned. "Defense attorneys often try to portray cases like this as family disagreements rather than abuse. They'll argue that different treatment isn't necessarily harmful treatment, but we have evidence," I said. "We do. Your recordings, the photographic evidence, testimony from witnesses who observed the differential treatment. It's a strong case." After Maria left, Rosa and I sat in her small kitchen drinking tea and trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a few hours. "How are you feeling?" Rosa asked. "Numb, mostly, and scared." "Scared of what?" "Of what comes next, of having to face them in court, of everyone knowing our family business." Rosa reached across the table and took my hand. "Honey, what happened to you wasn't family business, it was criminal behavior disguised as parenting. There's a difference."
That afternoon, Dylan called. His voice sounded shaky and uncertain. "They made bail," he said. "They're home, but they're not allowed to contact you directly." "How are they?" "Angry. Scared. Dad keeps saying this is all a misunderstanding that will get cleared up in court." Mom hasn't stopped crying. "And how are you?" There was a long pause. "Confused. I keep thinking about things differently now, like remember last Christmas, when you got that gift card and I got the laptop and the watch and the trip money. I remember. At the time I thought it made sense because I had more expensive interests. But now I'm wondering if maybe that was just an excuse." It was the first time Dylan had ever questioned the logic of our parents' differential treatment. "It's hard to see patterns when you're in the middle of them," I said.
Yeah. Listen, I know this is awkward.
"But I want you to know that I'm not taking their side just because they're my parents too. If they really did what CPS says they did, then they should face consequences.
Thank you.
That means more than you know." The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls from lawyers, meetings with social workers, and media attention that I hadn't expected. Apparently, child neglect cases involving middle-class suburban families were newsworthy, especially when they involved arrests and dramatic police escorts. A reporter from the local newspaper called Rosa's apartment 3 times before we finally unplugged the phone. Someone had leaked details about the case, and suddenly our family's private dysfunction was being discussed on local news broadcasts. "Riverside County parents arrested for systematic child neglect," the headline read. "Affluent family accused of providing substandard care to one child while favoring another." The article included quotes from neighbors who claimed they had always thought something seemed off about the Brooks family dynamic. Miss Him, from next door, told the reporter that she had noticed I was much thinner than Dylan and that I rarely seemed to participate in family activity. Principal Foster was quoted as saying that school officials had expressed concern about potential neglect, but had been assured by my parents that I was simply an independent child who preferred to handle things on my own. Reading about my life in the newspaper was surreal and humiliating, but also validating. For 17 years I had been told that my perceptions were wrong, that I was too sensitive, that our family was normal. Now strangers were reading about our situation and recognizing it as clearly abusive. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Rosa took the day off work to come with me, and Maria met us at the courthouse to explain what would happen. "Today is just procedural," she said. "The charges will be read, your parents will enter pleas, and bail conditions will be set. You probably won't need to speak, but you'll be in the courtroom in case the judge has questions." The courthouse was an imposing building with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. We sat in the back of the courtroom and waited for the case to be called. When Kenneth and Patricia were brought in, I barely recognized them. Kenneth, who had always been impeccably dressed and confident, looked haggard and smaller somehow. Patricia, who prided herself on her appearance and social standing, looked like she had aged 10 years in a week. Their lawyer was a well-dressed man who moved with the kind of confidence that came from expensive legal training. When the charges were read, he entered pleas of not guilty on their behalf and requested that bail conditions be modified to allow limited contact with family members. "Your Honor," he said, "my clients are respected members of the community with no prior criminal history. These charges stem from a family disagreement that has been blown out of proportion by an overzealous social services department." The prosecutor, a stern woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, stood to respond. "Your Honor, this case involves systematic child neglect, spanning multiple years. The defendants provided substandard care to one child while giving preferential treatment to another. They plan to legally abandon a minor child for their own financial convenience. This is not a family disagreement. This is criminal behavior that caused significant emotional and physical harm to a vulnerable child." The judge, an older man who looked like he had seen every possible variation of human behavior, reviewed the case file before speaking. "The charges are serious and the evidence appears substantial. Bail will remain as set, with the condition that the defendants have no direct contact with the minor victim. Indirect contact through family members is permitted only for essential communication related to the legal proceeding." Kenneth and Patricia were released, but they couldn't call me, text me, or visit me. Any communication had to go through Dylan or their lawyer. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting with cameras and microphones. Rosa shielded me from them as we walked to her car, but I could hear their questions being shouted over the noise of traffic. "Natalie, how do you feel about your parents being arrested? Do you think they deserve to go to prison? What was it like living in that household?" I didn't answer any of them. What could I say? That I felt relief mixed with guilt. That I was terrified of what came next, but also hopeful that someone would finally hold my parents accountable. That 17 years of systematic abuse couldn't be summarized in a soundbite for the evening news. That evening, Dylan called again. "They want to talk to you," he said. "The court order says they can't contact me directly." "I know. They want me to pass along a message." I hesitated. Part of me was curious about what they wanted to say. Another part of me was afraid it would just be more manipulation and gaslighting. "What's the message?" "They want you to know that they love you and they're sorry for any pain they've caused. They want to work things out as a family without involving the courts. Work things out how they're willing to pay for your college. They want to include you more in family decisions. They promise to treat you and me equally going forward." I was quiet for a long time thinking about this offer. It was everything I had wanted for 17 years. Recognition, equality, inclusion, financial support. All I had to do was ask the prosecutor to drop the charges and pretend that none of this had ever happened. "Dylan, do you think they would have made these promises if I hadn't called CPS?" Another long pause. "No. Probably not." "Do you think they would keep these promises if the legal pressure went away?" An even longer pause. "I don't know. I do know. They would keep them for a few months, maybe a year. Until they felt safe again. Then things would gradually go back to the way they were. Because that's who they are. People don't change their fundamental character because they get caught. They change their behavior temporarily until the consequences go away." "So what are you going to say?" "I'm going to say that love isn't just words. It's actions. It's choices. It's treating someone with respect and equality every day, not just when you're facing criminal charges." Dylan was quiet for a moment. "They're really going to go to trial, aren't they?" "Yeah, and I'm going to testify about what really happened in our house for 17 years. Even if it means they might go to prison. Because maybe next time, parents who think about treating their children unequally will remember what happened to Kenneth and Patricia Brooks. And they'll choose differently." After I hung up, Rosa found me sitting on her couch staring at nothing. Second thoughts? She asked. No, but it's hard. They're still my parents. Even if they were terrible at it. Holding people accountable for their actions isn't cruel, Natalie. It's necessary. And sometimes it's the most loving thing you can do. Because it forces them to confront the reality of their choices. Do you think they'll ever understand what they did wrong? I don't know. But I know that you understand what they did wrong. And that you're strong enough to survive it and move forward. That night, I called Maria to let her know that my parents had attempted indirect contact, and that I would not be asking for the charges to be dropped. I'm proud of you, she said. That couldn't have been an easy decision. It was the only decision. If I don't follow through now, then 17 years of suffering meant nothing. It didn't mean nothing. It meant that you learned how to survive impossible circumstances. It meant that you developed strength and resilience that most people never need to find. It meant that you're prepared for whatever comes next. What does come next? Justice. Real justice. Not just the appearance of it. And then you get to build the life you've always deserved. As I settled into bed in Rosa's guest room, I thought about the word justice. For 17 years, I had believed that justice meant my parents finally treating me fairly. Now I understood that justice meant consequences for people who hurt children, even when those people were parents and those children were their own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more court hearings, more media attention, more opportunities for my parents to try to manipulate the narrative. But tonight, for the first time in my life, I was sleeping in a house where I was wanted, protected, and valued. And tomorrow, I would wake up as someone who had chosen to fight back instead of disappearing. 6 months later, I stood outside the Riverside County Courthouse on a crisp spring morning, wearing a navy blue dress that Rosa had helped me pick out for the sentencing hearing. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from social workers, teachers, neighbors, and family members who had witnessed years of systematic favoritism disguised as normal parenting. The jury had deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: child neglect in the first degree, emotional abuse of a minor, and conspiracy to abandon a dependent child. The evidence had been overwhelming, from my recordings to the photographic documentation, to the testimony of witnesses who had observed the differential treatment, but had been too polite to intervene. Maria Santos met me on the courthouse steps, carrying the same professional folder she had brought to every hearing. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Ready," I said, and I meant it. The courtroom was packed with reporters, social workers, and community members who had followed the case. Kenneth and Patricia sat at the defendant's table with their lawyer, looking smaller and more defeated than I had ever seen them. They had aged visibly during the trial, the stress of public exposure and legal consequences etching new lines on their faces. Dylan sat in the gallery, having testified for the prosecution about the differential treatment he had witnessed, but never questioned. His testimony had been particularly powerful because he had no motivation to lie about his parents' behavior. If anything, it would have been easier for him to minimize what had happened. Judge Morrison called the court to order, and the sentencing phase began. The prosecutor stood to address the court first. "Your Honor, this case represents a particularly insidious form of child abuse," she said. "The defendants systematically deprived one child of basic emotional and material support, while providing preferential treatment to another child in the same household. They planned to legally abandon a minor child to avoid financial responsibility for her education and future. This behavior caused significant psychological harm, and would have caused additional harm if not for the intervention of Child Protective Services." She recommended the maximum sentence allowed under state guidelines: 2 years in prison for each defendant, plus 5 years of supervised probation. The defense attorney stood to present his mitigation argument. "Your Honor, my clients are first-time offenders who have already suffered significant consequences from these proceedings. They have lost their reputations in the community, faced public humiliation, and been estranged from their daughter. They understand now that their parenting methods were flawed, and they are committed to making amends. He requested suspended sentences with community service and mandatory family therapy. Then Judge Morrison asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I had been preparing for this moment for months, but as I walked to the podium, my hands were still shaking. Your Honor, I began. For 17 years I believed that I was the problem in my family. I believed that I was difficult, ungrateful, and inherently less deserving of love and support than my brother. My parents convinced me, and everyone around us, that I was naturally independent and preferred to be excluded from family activities and celebrations. I paused to gather my composure, looking out at the courtroom, filled with faces I didn't recognize. But children aren't naturally independent. Children learn to be independent when their needs for attention and care are consistently unmet. I learned to expect less because less was all I ever received. I learned to be invisible because visibility brought disappointment. I looked directly at Kenneth and Patricia, who were both staring at the table in front of them. The defendants didn't just fail to provide equal care for their children. They actively created a system where one child was celebrated while the other was systematically erased. They didn't just neglect my physical needs by providing substandard food and living conditions. They neglected my emotional needs by treating my achievements as unworthy of recognition and my future as unworthy of investment. My voice grew stronger as I continued. Most damaging of all, they planned to legally abandon me while I was still a minor, not out of any concern for my well-being, but for their own financial convenience. They were willing to destroy my future to protect their bank account. I had more to say, but I realized that the most important part was yet to come. However, I want the court to know that I am not here seeking revenge. I am here seeking justice, not just for myself, but for other children who might find themselves in similar situations. Parents who think they can treat their children unequally need to understand that there are legal consequences for systematic favoritism and emotional abuse. I looked around the courtroom one more time. I have survived 17 years of systematic neglect, and I will continue to thrive in spite of what was done to me. But no child should have to develop survival skills just to exist in their own family. When I finished, the courtroom was completely silent. Judge Morrison took notes for several minutes before speaking. This case has highlighted a form of child abuse that often goes unrecognized because it occurs within families that appear functional from the outside. The evidence presented during this trial demonstrates a pattern of behavior that caused significant psychological harm to a vulnerable child. He addressed Kenneth and Patricia directly. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks, you had a legal and moral obligation to provide equal care for both of your children. Instead, you created a household where one child was treated as valuable while the other was treated as expendable. Your actions were not the result of different parenting styles or personality conflicts. They constituted systematic child abuse. The judge sentenced Kenneth to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Patricia received the same sentence. Both would be required to complete parenting classes and undergo psychological evaluation before being eligible for any future contact with minor children. Additionally, they were ordered to pay restitution for my therapy costs, educational expenses, and damages related to the emotional harm they had caused. As the bailiff led my parents away in handcuffs, Patricia turned to look at me one last time. Her expression was a mixture of sorrow, anger, and something that might have been regret. Kenneth kept his eyes straight ahead, his jaw set in the stubborn line I recognized from years of family arguments. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around asking for my reaction to the sentencing. Rosa had prepared me for this moment, and I had decided in advance what I wanted to say. I hope this case sends a message to parents that all children deserve equal treatment, love, and support, I said. Favoritism isn't a parenting style.
When it becomes systematic and extreme, it's a form of abuse that causes real harm to real children. Someone asked if I felt justice had been served. Justice isn't just about punishment, I said. It's about acknowledgement. For 17 years I was told that my experiences weren't real, that I was too sensitive, that I should be grateful for what I received. Today, a court of law has acknowledged that what happened to me was real, harmful, and illegal. That acknowledgement is worth more than any prison sentence. The months that followed were challenging in ways I hadn't expected. Living with Rosa was wonderful, but adjusting to being truly cared for took time. I had to learn to accept kindness without expecting it to be withdrawn later. I had to learn to express my needs and preferences instead of just accepting whatever was offered. I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in family trauma and emotional abuse. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that the hypervigilance, people-pleasing and self-doubt I experienced were normal responses to growing up in an environment where my basic worth was constantly questioned. You developed incredible survival skills, she told me during one of our sessions, but now you need to learn that you don't just have to survive anymore, you get to thrive. I graduated as valedictorian of my high school class. Rosa sat in the front row of the auditorium, tears streaming down her face as I delivered my speech about resilience and the power of speaking truth even when it's difficult. Several colleges offered me full scholarships based on my academic record and the media attention surrounding my case. I chose a school 3 hours away that had an excellent psychology program. I wanted to study family therapy and eventually work with children who had experienced abuse and neglect. Dylan and I maintained a relationship, though it was complicated. He struggled with guilt about the privileges he had received while I was being systematically excluded. He also grappled with anger toward our parents for putting him in the position of being the favored child, which came with its own psychological burden. I keep thinking about how different things could have been, he told me during one of our phone conversations. If they had just treated us both fairly, we could have had a normal family. We did have a normal family, I said. For our family, systematic favoritism was normal. That was the problem. Kenneth and Patricia were released from prison after serving 14 months of their sentences. They were required to live in a halfway house and couldn't contact me directly without court permission, which I had no intention of granting. Dylan told me they had both completed the required parenting classes and psychological counseling, but he wasn't sure how much they had actually changed. Dad still thinks the whole thing was blown out of proportion, he said. Mom seems to understand better, but she's also bitter about the prison time and the public humiliation. Understanding and taking responsibility are two different things, I replied. A year after the sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through Dylan. It was from Patricia, written in her careful handwriting on plain stationery. Dear Natalie, it began. I know I'm not supposed to contact you directly, but I needed you to know that I think about you every day. I've spent the last year trying to understand how things went so wrong, and I've come to realize that your father and I failed you in ways that can never be undone. The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing her regrets and her new understanding of how their favoritism had harmed me. She acknowledged specific incidents that I had mentioned in my testimony, admitting that she now understood how those moments had felt from my perspective. I don't expect forgiveness, she wrote near the end. I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that you were right to speak up. You were right to call for help. You were right to demand better treatment. I'm sorry it took a criminal conviction for me to understand what we had done to you. The letter was signed simply, Mom, though she had lost the right to use that title years before the trial ever began. I showed the letter to Dr. Martinez during our next session. How does it feel to read this? She asked. Validating, I said. But also sad. She's acknowledging things now that she could have acknowledged years ago if she had been willing to listen to me instead of dismissing my concern. Do you think her understanding is genuine? I think her regret is genuine. Whether her understanding runs deep enough to prevent her from making similar choices in the future, I don't know. Are you considering responding to her? I thought about this question for a long time. Part of me wanted to engage with Patricia's apparent growth and remorse. Another part of me recognized that I didn't owe her anything, including forgiveness or reconciliation. No, I said. Finally, she had 17 years to see me as a person worthy of equal treatment. She chose not to during all that time. Her regret now, while perhaps sincere, doesn't erase the harm she caused or create an obligation for me to participate in her healing process. Dr. Martinez nodded. You get to choose what kind of relationship, if any, you want to have with your parents going forward. You don't owe them forgiveness just because they now understand what they did wrong. As my freshman year of college progressed, I found myself thinking less about my childhood and more about my future. I was studying hard, making friends, and slowly learning to trust that good things could happen without being taken away later. I also became involved in advocacy work related to child welfare and abuse prevention. I spoke at conferences about recognizing emotional abuse and systematic favoritism in families. I volunteered with organizations that supported children in foster care and those aging out of the system. My story had become public record, and sometimes people recognized me from news coverage of the trial. Most were supportive, but occasionally someone would suggest that I had overreacted, or that sending my parents to prison was too hard. Families fight. One woman told me after a conference presentation, children and parents don't always get along. That doesn't mean parents should go to jail. You're right that families fight, I replied, but there's a difference between normal family conflict and systematic abuse. When parents consistently provide one child with restaurant meals while giving another child leftovers, that's not a family fight, that's neglect. When parents plan to legally abandon a minor child for financial convenience, that's not a disagreement, that's abandonment. These conversations reminded me why the legal consequences had been necessary. Without accountability, systematic favoritism, and emotional abuse often get dismissed as normal family dynamics, rather than recognized as the harmful behaviors they actually are. 2 years after the trial, I received another piece of correspondence related to my case. This time it was from a mother in another state who had read about our story online. She wrote to tell me that my case had prompted her to examine her own family dynamics, and she had realized that she was treating her 2 children very differently. I was giving my older daughter more privileges and attention while expecting my younger daughter to be more independent. She wrote, after reading about your experience, I realized that I was creating the same kind of harmful environment in my own home. I've started therapy, and I'm working to change my behavior before I cause permanent damage to my relationship with my younger daughter. Letters like this made all the pain of the trial and its aftermath feel worthwhile. If my willingness to speak publicly about systematic favoritism prevented even one child from experiencing what I had endured, then the embarrassment and difficulty of legal proceedings had served a greater purpose. On the 3-year anniversary of calling Child Protective Services, I was sitting in my dorm room studying for finals when Rosa called. I have news, she said. Good news. What kind of news? Dylan called. Your parents' probation officer contacted him about a victim impact survey they're required to complete before their probation ends. One of the questions asks whether they believe their victim has been able to move forward and rebuild their life. Okay. Dylan told them about your academic success, your scholarship, your advocacy work, and how well you're doing in college. He said when Patricia heard about your accomplishments, she broke down crying because she was proud, because she realized that you had succeeded not because of their parenting, but in spite of it. I was quiet for a moment, processing this information. How do you feel about that? Rosa asked. I feel like it's the first time she's ever really understood what she lost, I said. Not just her relationship with me, but the opportunity to actually parent me. She missed out on supporting my achievements, celebrating my successes, and being part of my growth. and she missed out by choice. Do you think you'll ever want a relationship with them again? It was a question I'd been asked many times. By therapists, by Dylan, by well-meaning friends, who believed that family reconciliation was always the ideal outcome. I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe someday, if they truly change and if I feel like it would add value to my life, rather than just satisfy their need for redemption. But I've learned that I don't need their approval or their presence to be complete. You've built a good life for yourself. We've built a good life, I corrected. You saved me, just as much as I saved myself. After we hung up, I went back to studying, but my mind kept wandering to that scared 17-year-old girl who had finally found the courage to call for help. She couldn't have imagined that 3 years later, she would be thriving in college, helping other children recognize abuse, and living with the confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. Sometimes people ask me if I regret calling Child Protective Services, or if I wish I had tried to work things out privately with my family. The answer is always no. Some problems can't be solved with conversation or compromise. Some behaviors only change when there are serious consequences attached to them. My parents had 17 years to choose equality and kindness. They chose favoritism and neglect instead. It took a criminal conviction to make them acknowledge the harm they had caused. And even then, their understanding came too late to repair our relationship, but their consequences became my freedom. Their accountability became my validation. Their punishment became my peace. I learned that you don't have to accept mistreatment just because it comes from family members. You don't have to minimize abuse just because it doesn't leave physical scars. You don't have to protect people's reputations when they've failed to protect your well-being. Most importantly, I learned that speaking up about injustice, even when it's uncomfortable and complicated, is often the most powerful thing you can do for yourself and for others who might be suffering in silence. Today, I'm a senior in college, with plans to attend graduate school for clinical psychology. I live in a small apartment near campus, and every morning I wake up, knowing that I am safe, valued, and free to pursue my dreams, without worrying about whether I deserve them. I still keep a framed copy of my high school valedictorian speech on my desk, with one particular line highlighted. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to disappear. That scared, hungry, and visible teenager finally learned that she had never been the problem. She had been the solution, waiting for the right moment to save herself. And she did. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.